And what I'm going to have someone do is if someone would be willing to read verses 18 through 25. And if you would have, most of you may have received one of these or picked one of these up on the way in. If not, did everyone get one that wants one? Okay. Hey, Jim or Jerry, could I get one of you just to go back and maybe grab, they're on the stool there, and maybe just pass them out to those who didn't get it. And I did this last week. We won't read it direct off this page, because I realize it's a little hard to kind of follow and read it. But what I did is just kind of broke it down into sections, so you can kind of follow the logical order of Paul's thinking here, and it just kind of helps give you a little structure to what this text is saying to us. But I'd still encourage us and still suggest that we read it from the Pew Bible, just because it's a little easier to read than, again, the page is a little harder. And besides that, the translation you have on the paper in front of you is from the English Standard Version, and our Pew Bibles are the NIV, so there'll be a little difference there. But let's read verses 18 through 25. Is there someone who'd be willing to read that for us in a good, loud voice? All right, David, please. All right, perfect. Thank you, David. And then, Matt, if I could get you to jump one slide ahead. I forgot my little iPad, so I'm going to have to try to go from memory. What I'm going to have you do for maybe 3 minutes is work with the people around you, and groups of 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, and circle any words or phrases that are repeated in this text. Remember, this is always one of the first steps that we take, is just look for some of the repeated words or phrases. So go ahead and do that. Do it as quick as you can, and also look for, if you notice any grammatical details, those are maybe sometimes a little harder to spot, circle those as well, and then see if you can identify any Old Testament quotations as well. So go ahead, about 3 minutes or so to do that, and then we'll come back together. All right, about another minute or so. All right. I know time is quick there, but what did you come up with? What words do you hear repeated in this text? Just shout them out. Foolishness and wisdom. That's right. You don't get very far without seeing that quite a few times. Um, anyone else? There was one other one that was repeated twice, but besides the and those don't count. For yeah, those are important, but not so close to the theme. But there was one other little phrase. I wonder if anyone caught it. Jews and Greeks. Yeah, that's true. So that tells us he's contrasting two groups of people. That's right. Good. I had one more in mind. Yeah, Jerry. Power of God. That's right. Was that you were going to say, Debbie? Okay, yeah. And that one, I didn't notice that one until a little later, but that is at the beginning and the end, which always suggests kind of when you start off with something and then you come back to it at the end, and then it's kind of like you take an idea and then you develop it and then you return to it. So power of God is another one. Did anyone catch the Old Testament quotation? Bruce did. Okay. Where's it from? I don't know if the people Isaiah, yeah, Isaiah chapter 29:14. That's right, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But we'll need to pay attention to that because anytime we find an Old Testament quote in the New Testament, that's important. How about grammatical details? Any grammar things jump out at you? There was really only one that I saw as being particularly noteworthy, but maybe you caught another couple of them. Any of them? All right, I'll show you. If you look in verse 18 here, and it might help if you have it on your on the paper, because I don't know exactly how the NIV phrases it. But to those who are perishing, and then to us who are being saved. It's an ongoing present participle. And Paul, you notice how he does that just a little different. Those who are perishing versus who are being saved. The only thing worth noting there is that Paul is suggesting that salvation is it's an ongoing thing. It's not just an instantaneous thing, but it's okay. You're justified, but then there's this ongoing process of being saved. And so Paul is suggesting here that our salvation is it's an ongoing work. It's something that isn't finished the minute you put your faith in Christ. Your salvation is certain and it's guaranteed, but then the long work of God's working with you and refining you and saving you begins to happen, and it's made complete the day that Jesus returns. So just a little note there, and that's all packed into one little participle. How about that, hey? Let's go to the next slide there, Matt. Oh, by the way, just don't flip it yet. Just that little picture there, if you looked at that and wondered what it is, that's I think I showed that picture maybe once before. It's in Athens where Socrates took the hemlock, or where he stood trial. It says bema on the top and then speaker's platform, and so it's just a little, it's not much bigger than it's a little, I don't know, seems hard to stand on that, but that was where Socrates would have been put on trial, and then supposedly where he would have drank the hemlock and then died, because he was the wisdom, right? He was the guy who represented wisdom, and he was put on trial for corrupting the youth, as you may remember. So anyways, okay, next slide over. Okay, let's come to that quote here from Isaiah chapter 29, verse 14. Normally, if you had a lot of time, you'd go back to Isaiah and you'd want to dig into that a little bit. Since you don't have the time, I did that for you this week. Isaiah 29 is a passage where the prophet Isaiah is coming to the people, and he's warning them about the destruction that is coming to God's people. Isaiah is speaking a message of warning and judgment against the people. But then, as he's spelling out this warning of judgment, there's this sudden, Isaiah sort of changes his tune, and he actually says that it won't all be judgment, but actually God is going to spare his people. And then in the midst of that, then all the political pundits, I put that, all the experts would not be able to understand what in the world was God doing. How is, we expected destruction, and all of a sudden God is changing his plan. And what Isaiah is saying then is that God's ways cannot always be understood or comprehended. So Isaiah is speaking into this context of there's judgment coming, but God will also be sparing his people. And then Isaiah is saying what true wisdom is. God's ways of working often run so contrary to the ways of this world. And so Paul is quoting that, and really the point, and their hearts, because their hearts were far from God, is what what Isaiah is saying. They're not in tune with God, and so they can't see, they can't recognize what God is doing in the time of Isaiah. So Paul comes along and he quotes this verse, and what he's doing is he's really kind of he's applying that same idea to his present situation, where you've got Jews and Greeks together, who they both have different expectations, which we'll get to in a moment. But he says, look, the wisdom of the Jewish people and the wisdom of the Greeks is really out of tune with what God is doing in the world. Remember, we've been saying now that Corinth was a city that really prized wisdom as one of like the chief virtues. It was the thing that you ought to set your heart on and try to obtain. And Paul is coming along and saying, if you are out of tune with God, you're not going to be able to have this wisdom. This wisdom is going to be unobtainable for you. So recognize and you rely on your own understanding and your own wisdom, and you're not going to be seeing what in the world God is doing. Any questions on that Old Testament quotation, or either what Paul says about it or what Isaiah says? All right, then let's move on to the next thing, and then here, the next slide. So here's where, like Carl pointed out, he's contrasting Jews and Greeks, Paul is. He's saying the Jews have one idea of what wisdom is, and the Greeks have another. And Paul is saying they're both really missing out on what God is doing. Now, what did the Jews demand? Well, it's on the screen in front of you. The Jews demanded signs. Does anyone know, without looking too closely at the screen, because the answer is there in front of you if you read it too close, but can anyone fill in the blanks? What is that, when Paul says the Jews demand signs, does anyone know what he's getting at? Right. How are we going to know that you are the Messiah? What sign will you give us? Yeah, Carl, what were you going to say? Yep. That's right. So among the Jewish people, there was always this expectation that when the Messiah finally comes, we will know it by the signs that he does. And so they're always paying attention because there were lots of people who claimed to be the Messiah going into for hundreds of years. There were always people coming along and saying, I'm the Messiah. And so how do you tell the true one from the false one? Well, you look for the signs. That's what the Jews were looking for. So then Jane quotes the text from John chapter 6, where Jesus has just fed the 5,000 people, and then he enters into this long dialogue with the people, and the people are challenging Jesus. They're saying, okay, can you do something greater than what Moses has done by providing manna in the wilderness? So the Jews were not thoroughly impressed by the feeding of the 5,000. They wanted a bigger sign, because as far as they were concerned, okay, that's good, but Moses did that. You've got to do something better to prove that you are really the Messiah. So Paul says, okay, the Jews demand signs. They're always looking for a sign to validate the identity of the Messiah. Now, we're going to come back to that in a second, but let's look at what are the Greeks. Before you flip the slide, what are the Greeks after? What does Paul tell us that the Greeks are looking for? Wisdom, that's right. And wisdom was taught again in Athens and throughout Greece. It was a major thing. You had Socrates, you had Plato, you had Cicero, you had Aristotle, you had all these great teachers of wisdom. And so every person born in the Greek cities wanted wisdom. The only problem was wisdom was usually something that favored the elite. If you were wealthy, you could afford the tutors to give you the wisdom, or you could be born into a family that was considered wise or that sort of thing. But wisdom was something, and you had to spend your lifetime kind of chasing after it, or you had to be able to buy it, essentially. And so wisdom was one of these things that was highly prized and highly sought after, but often very few people could really, truly obtain full wisdom. So the Greeks demand wisdom. Let's go to the next slide. It was one of the ways that you could recognize wisdom is the rhetoric. The Greeks pioneered the art of public speaking and logic, and so they had these big. In fact, you can still see them. There are these big amphitheaters there that are cut into the side of these hills, and so you have Greek theater, but you also have people that would just give very flowery speeches. And so you could tell you had a wise person if they were really excellent in public speaking. So So the Greeks prized wisdom as this virtue, and as I said, the wisdom of the Greeks was either obtained, you either set your life on a course to go and grab it and get it, or you sort of look inwardly and you discover it inwardly, but most people, very few people could ever actually reach that point of true enlightenment. And so Paul's saying, okay, we've got two groups of people, and they're both really, they're both different, but they're both kind of aiming at the same goal. The Jews are looking for a sign, and the Greeks want to have someone who can really be excellent in public speaking, and those are the people that they're going to admire and worship. Someone who's really wise, or someone who could do these signs. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that presents a stumbling block for the gospel. Paul shows up in Corinth, and in many of the other cities as well, and he's preaching something that runs completely against the grain of what these two groups wanted. On the one hand, the Jewish people, they could not for the life of them imagine how their Messiah would suffer. That was so impossible in their minds. Right? A Messiah was actually going to rise to the top and be a triumphant military leader or something of that sort, but was not going to be suffering a death, especially a death on a cross. Right? You know, the death on the cross is what Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, and he's quoting from Deuteronomy. That's a death of being accursed, right? And so Paul says to the Galatians, look, I recognize how strange this sounds. You have a Messiah who suffers. That was not what anybody ever expected, although they should have expected it, you might argue. But they didn't. They were expecting a Messiah to do signs. The Greeks, on the other hand, they were not impressed so much with the eloquence of Jesus, but they also, more to the point, they thought that the shame and humiliation surrounding the cross was also, that didn't fit with what wisdom looked like. Right? Wisdom is polished, and it's rhetorical, and it's dignified. It's not being stripped naked and nailed up on a cross for everyone to see and mock. So Paul says, I realize that this is an incredible stumbling block for Jews and for Greeks. You've got a Messiah who doesn't fit into either category. Let's go to the next slide. But what Paul says, and that's why I point out that he begins and ends with power. Paul says that the cross is weakness in the eyes of human beings, but to those who are being saved, the cross is power. It's power because God is taking upon himself the curse of sin, and he's restoring us into our relationship with God. So it's through the cross, through this picture of weakness, that the power of God is unleashed into our lives. And I guess maybe a way to summarize that is by saying that the cross is really, in the cross we see that God's ways of working are really upside down. Right? In other words, what is the path to being exalted? Well, it's being humbled, right? What does it look like to be great? It's to be a servant. See, so Paul is saying that the whole way that the world has it is all completely upside down and backwards, and God comes along and it's through the cross that he turns reality on its head, as it were. And that's the power of God. If we want to experience the power of God, what is it? We serve. We sacrifice ourselves. We follow Jesus. We follow a Savior who was executed. It's hard for us to imagine, by the way, just how the culture of that time really looked at execution on a cross. I don't think there's anything comparable to it today, but the shame, the humiliation, the sense of being accursed, that was all wrapped up in the idea of the cross. There's nothing in my mind I can think of that compares to that, and yet that's how our Savior lives and dies, and that was his purpose. So let's go to I think it's the last slide, because then the question for us is, okay, so and here's where I want to just hear some of your thoughts on this. What is the wisdom of our world today, right? What is the way of the world today that our culture tells us that how we need to live, or things we need to value, or kind of the idea that the world works? Yeah, Jerry. Yes, that is a big one, especially in North America, right? Acquisition of wealth, materialism, consumerism, right? What else? Status, yeah, and power. That's right. These are the things that we need to set our hearts and lives on. Facebook too, I know I sound very anti-Facebook a lot, and I'm not totally. one of the ways that I see it misused is this way of we put our lives all the way out there, and it's sort of like the more friends you get, the higher you rank. Um, and again, I'm not anti-Facebook wholesale, get rid of it, but it's just an observation. That's more of a reflection of what our culture does with these worldly virtues. Yeah, Paul. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's right. Right. The problem when people rule is that people are flawed and sinful. Right. So, when it becomes each person, we have their rights trump everybody else. It becomes very difficult and challenging for us. And I think it's good to be able to critique our own systems without, sometimes remembering that there are a lot of systems that are much worse. But yeah. Anyways, Carl, your hand was up. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. I was doing a little reading just before the service too, and Socrates. So you may know a little bit. He was put on trial for corrupting the youth, and then he was found guilty and sentenced to die by the hemlock poisoning. And he actually had a chance to escape, but he wouldn't do it, and he wouldn't do it because he believed that if you promote the values of democracy, then you have to be willing to subject yourself to it. And in his case, that meant, okay, I've got to take the penalty. I've got to be sentenced to death here. So he wouldn't escape for that reason. But he was critical of. He believed in democracy, but he was critical of it as well. And I think again, we're not fomenting insurrection or something like that here. We're just being critics of our own system that says, okay, so what are the weaknesses of it? If we have a view of human nature such that we recognize the fallenness of the human heart, that's going to show up in whatever system you create, economic system, political system, and so on. So we have to be able to critique our system. And in America, the value of liberty, right, is a big deal, and freedom, and let me do what I want to do, which has some very good things. Because if you've ever been to countries where there's totalitarian rule, you see the downside of it. You see that that's dangerous. But then you also have to be willing to critique our own system and say, okay, when you let the human heart be completely autonomous, that has its downsides as well. Any other thoughts on what is the wisdom of our age? The pursuit of happiness. That's right. We are told that that's what we have to go after and chase after, right? Happy. We think we're entitled to it sometimes. Good. Science. Yeah. Right. Prove it. Right. That's right. That becomes the means of knowledge for our culture, and if so, therefore you get rid of all the supernatural because you can't prove it. Right. Um, yeah. Anyone else? Debbie. Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. It becomes a very intolerant form of tolerance. Absolutely. Accept that value. That's right. That's right. There are no absolutes except the absolute that there are no absolutes. So, how then does the gospel challenge these values, these ideas of wisdom? How does the gospel? We've kind of touched on some of them, but what else? Maybe you want to fill in some of the blanks. How does the gospel challenge, let's say, the pursuit of happiness? What does the gospel say to that? Hmm. Right. Okay. That's right. So rather than trying to be the star on the stage with the spotlight shining only on me, happiness is about, okay, let me serve my neighbor, right? I think, Debbie, I heard you saying something as well. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Right. That's right. Yeah, right. And I think the other thing too, it's a struggle, but there's joy in that process, right? So in other words, when we critique the idea of happiness, we aren't saying, okay, God doesn't want anyone to be too happy here. What we're saying is it's like God redefines what true happiness is, right? Psalm 1, blessed is he who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, but whose delight is in the law of God. There, the word blessed there is actually the word happiness. And we sometimes bristle a little bit at that because we think, well, happiness can be so worldly, but what the psalmist is doing is saying this is what true happiness is like. It's self-sacrifice. It's giving yourself to others. That's where we find joy, even mixed in with pain too. So, um, other, how about liberty? Right? We talked about liberty being one of the virtues of our world, the wisdom of our world. How does the gospel challenge that idea? What are your thoughts on that? Hmm. Right. Right. It, right. 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 That's right. So we can become who we are meant to be. Right. That's right. You've all heard the saying, don't ask a fish what it feels like to be underwater because they're underwater all the time. It's the same kind of thing, right? When we're surrounded by these virtues, we don't understand anything different. We are surrounded by this idea of freedom as I can do whatever I want, and yet true freedom is found when we're set free from that idea, where freedom is actually living as God intended us to, right? And we can't do that until the gospel tells us that God deals with our sin. Okay, what does it look like? Let me close with this question. What does it look like to live out of the weakness of the cross? What does that look like for us today? We've touched on some of these themes kind of throughout, but maybe we want to just crystallize it here. Hmm. Good, yeah. That's right. That's right. Fair point. That's right. Right. Yeah, you're right. It changes what weakness is, right? Weakness is actually sacrifice. The world looks at that and says, meek, and you're going to be trampled all over. And we say, actually, there's nothing stronger than this. Yeah, David. Hmm. Right. Church growth. Hmm. Right. Yeah. Excellent point. Very true. Very true. That's right. That's an excellent point. In fact, we're going to come back to that in a little bit because Paul kind of talks about his own methods of winning the people over. And today we could look at that and say, church growth ideas. Yeah. Hmm. Right. That's right. 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 That's right. Yeah. Right. It's hard for us to accept some of the claims of the gospel too. Even if we've been a lifelong believer, we still hear, oh, we still want to fight back and say, I'm not that bad. It's the people out there that are bad. It's not me. But as you know, as we again, as we understand what is the claim of the gospel, it's really that we are far worse than we'd ever like to think, but we are far more loved through Christ